So Matt, you are actually the founder of the People's Policy Project. It's a really great kind of small indie think tank in Washington, D.C. Puts out a lot of really great papers. Recently, y'all had a paper on the racial wealth gap. It's often explained as a gap between whites and blacks. That's how when we talk about racial disparity, we're talking about two different racial groups. But sometimes the way it's explained is as if the two groups are monolithic. Sometimes it's almost like you're talking about two different people. There's one person in one category, one person in the other category. But as we know, both these groups have tens of millions of people. In the case of whites, certainly it's a massive group of people. 200 million people, I think, in the U.S. around that. And you actually found there's a lot of differences within those groups, and that maybe another way to think about this wealth gap is that it's actually a gap where a lot of people of both groups just don't have that much wealth to begin with, but there may be a bigger disparity with the top. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the one kind of easy way to do the racial wealth gap thing is to just, let's add up all the black wealth divided by the number of black households. Usually wealth is done on a household level because, it's kind of difficult with spouses to distinguish, who owns what. And let's do the same thing for white families. How much per household? And you do that and you get about $900,000 per white family, which is very high. It's a very high amount. And then for black families, it's 140,000. And so you'll see either that statistic or you'll see a statistic where they're comparing the median white family to the median black family, and you'll see a big disparity. And what I actually kind of figured out many years ago when I was trying to kind of come up with different proposals about how to fix the racial wealth gap is that if you take those averages and you break them out in each group and you say, okay, we know on average white families have $900,000, but how much do the bottom 10% of white families have? How much do the middle 10%? How much do the top 10%? And when you do that, you basically find that the top 10% of white families owns 75% of white wealth. And then the bottom half owns like 2%. And then you have a sort of middle class in the middle that owns the remaining 23% or whatever. You go into the black family, you say, okay, that's very interesting. White wealth very unevenly distributed. It's mostly at the top. Now, when I first get that finding, I'm kind of like, in some ways, this is helpful for closing the racial wealth gap because you don't really have to ask too many people to pay. If there's only a handful of white people who have the wealth, it's like, we always have the problem with middle class taxes and people don't want to pay that. You don't need middle class taxes because all the wealth's at the top, at least, for this kind of project. So, okay, well, let's look at the black wealth distribution. You go to the black wealth distribution, the same thing, it looks identical. The top 10% of black families own 75% or more of black wealth, bottom half, 1-2%. Now, the total amount of wealth is much lower, as we just discussed, but the distribution within each race is basically the same. And so you kind of take a step back and you say, wow, this overall disparity is really driven by the fact that the top 10% of white people are very, very wealthy. The top 10% of black people they own almost all black wealth, but they're not nearly as wealthy as the top 10% of white people. And that's driving the whole show. And I show in my piece that that's driving about 77.5%, over 3/4 of the racial wealth gap is just the difference between the wealthiest 10% of white people and the wealthiest 10% of black people. And once you figure that out, it kind of changes the story of like, what are we going to do here to fix this problem? It throws a wrench in things.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't sound like from the numbers that you just relayed that we really are talking about just like grabbing someone from each population and then you're assured that one is going to be just way wealthier than the other because so much of it is towards the top. It seems like actually if you look at like the bottom half of each group, there's just not a whole lot of wealth there, period.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so one kind of neat statistic would be, let's take the bottom 10% of white families and the bottom 10% of black families. What's the difference between them? And the answer is $15,000. And hey, 15,000. I would like to have 15,000 more dollars. Like, who wouldn't?
Mhm.
You go to the top 10% of white families and the top 10% of black families, the average difference there is $5.6 million.
Mhm.
So the gap between sort of the black and white upper class is like 350 times larger than the gap between the white and black lower class, defined as the top 10% and bottom 10%.
Do you have any information about where that wealth at the top is stored? Like, we often think about a lot of average people, which is another reason why the racial wealth gap conversation can be a little maddening at times because a lot of people just don't have like wealth. Like when I think about money, I just think about my income. Like I don't have a house, I don't have like cars, and I don't have fancy paintings or property or anything. I don't even have that much wealth to begin with. So at the very top where all this wealth is stored, where are they storing this wealth? Like what does that wealth consist of?
Yeah, it consists of mostly corporate equity of one sort or another. So you could think about Jeff Bezos. He has over $100 billion in wealth. It's almost all Amazon stock, which I think he owns something like 20 or 30% of. So he doesn't even own the whole company, but he owns like 20 to 30% of it, and that is enough to get him to that level. And some really affluent people own their own businesses, and so you'll get the equity of their own business. I guess Amazon is sort of Jeff's business, not really anymore because it's publicly traded, but that's really where it is. And I think you're right, there is a very big difference, and part of the reason why I think people can sometimes get a bit confused about this between the way, I don't know, middle class people might think about wealth and the way the people who actually own almost all the wealth think about it. And someone pointed this out on Twitter when I was kind of having a discussion about this piece. They were saying, well, the reason that there's a little bit of difficulty in comprehending this is that, a normal person, a media person who might be middle class and like talks about this thing, when they're thinking about wealth, they're thinking about basically two things. They want to buy a home, they want to have money to retire, and maybe save money for college. That's really what they're thinking about. It's just kind of getting through life. And, that's important, but that's not where the big bucks are. It's not like Jeff Bezos has a giant 401k or 529, or, I mean, he does have a giant house, but like, that's not what it's about.
Yeah, and so I know you've done a lot of work on like closing these gaps or at least reducing their size, not only like between racial categorizations, but between class categorizations or any other way you can think of people, just the closing gaps between people who are on the bottom and people who are on the top. Uh, you know, what are some ideas you think that could be helpful in that regard? And maybe what's your critique of maybe some of the other ideas you've seen out there that maybe wouldn't be as helpful given the information that you've discovered and seen?
So, when it comes to the racial wealth gap, over the years, I've kind of thought about four different possibilities. The first one, and people talk a lot about this, though I don't think they think too hard about it, is let's just get the median black family up to the median white family, right? And that is actually not difficult to do because, like we said, there's very little wealth in the bottom and in the middle of society,
Mm.
right? The bottom half owns like 1 or 2% of the wealth. And of course, the black population is only 13% of the population. So if you want to kind of top them off and get them to the median, I calculated it's about 0.5% of national wealth. Like you could pretty much do that by just getting some money from white billionaires together, and you could make it happen.
Hmm.
But as you might expect, something that cheap doesn't really solve the big problem. In fact, it only solves about 3% of the problem if you're talking about the overall racial wealth gap.
Hmm.
So that seems like a dead end. Like a solution that not where 97% of the racial wealth gap remains is no solution at all, it would seem to me. So then you move into the second category and you say, okay, we're not going to close the median, we're going to close the mean, the average, right? The difference between 900,000 for white families and 140 for black families. And how are we going to do that? And you kind of break off into two ideas. You say, well, let's just make the black distribution match the white distribution, right? So, the wealthiest black person will have as much as the wealthiest white person. The poorest black person will have as much as the poorest white person. So it'll be very unequal, but it'll be equal between the races. They'll look the same. The lines will
Yeah,
overlap, right?
yeah.
But when you kind of go down that path, you say, well, if we did that, then that would mean that we would give, again, 350 times more money to the wealthiest Black families than the poorest Black families,
Hmm.
which also seems absurd, right? So then you go into a third possibility and you say, well, okay, why don't we just give out an equal amount to each Black family and we'll close the mean that way? And I've done the math on that. It's a little over 600,000. That's how much you'd have to give to each family to bring the 900,000 for whites and 140 to blacks to bring them together.
Hmm.
But when you do that and you give every Black family whatever it is, $620,000 or something like that, what ends up happening is the poorest Black family, literally the poorest Black family in the country, is wealthier than 68% of white families.
Mm.
So there are no Black families in the bottom 2/3 of society. And curiously, there also would be very few Black families at the very top of society, because
Mm.
600,000 is not going to get you up into the 1% or anything like
And,
that.
and by the way, as a side note, the Latino wealth is very similar to Black wealth, right? Like it's
Yes, it's almost
fairly.
identical.
So this would also leave that group just completely out
Yeah.
to dry.
Yeah, they would still be just like the Black wealth distribution, just still hanging out, as they are now.
Mm.
Some people say, well, okay, maybe we should address that separately or whatever. But yeah, they wouldn't be helped by that. But anyway, so you're like, well, that's kind of silly as well. It would seem a little bit weird to imagine that, but for histories of racism and slavery and Jim Crow and so on, every Black family would be in like the upper middle class. There would be none at the top and none at the bottom. Um,
Yeah.
that doesn't really make sense either. So that's number 3. So then you go, okay, well, the median doesn't really work. Matching the distributions, that seems goofy. You're just giving a bunch of money to affluent Black families. Flat payment, weird. Just every Black family's in the upper middle class. Like, and then you're left with, well, we need to do general redistribution.
Mm.
The top 10% of the country in terms of wealth is almost all white, like 90+% white. The
Mm.
bottom half is about 50-50, Black,
Right.
Latino, and white, or I guess I should say non-white and white, right? 50-50. So move money from the top to the bottom, you solve both problems at the same time, because the racial gap shrinks and the class gap shrinks, and you don't run into those other problems. It just sort of solves both problems simultaneously, brings everyone up together. You would think less resentment from Latinos and poor whites who are kind of like, well,
Right.
hey, what's
Well,
up?
here's one question. What's the mechanism by which you would move this money around? Primarily like taxation?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a proposal called a social wealth fund, and the way it would work is we'd create basically a mutual fund that the government would administer, and every adult would get 1 share of ownership in the fund, and we would tax the wealthy, and we would just put it in the fund. And so as the fund got bigger and bigger, your share would get bigger and bigger, and you'd get a dividend from your share each year. And so through that process, you're taking from the top, but then you're giving out to everyone equally. And so that will shrink the gap over time. And we have a program sort of like this in Alaska, where they have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a big $60 billion wealth fund that's invested in stocks and bonds and real estate. And every year they cut a check to every Alaskan from it, called the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. So that's sort of my idea. But you could do other things as well. I mean, just cutting down the wealth of the top 1% gets you quite a ways. They own about 40% of the national wealth. And it's almost all white. So just cutting them down through taxation is going to shrink a lot, even if you just then use the taxes on whatever, child care or
Right.
health care or whatever.
Well, one thing that's interesting about the taxes is that, we often think about like income taxes, like most people, middle class people get their money through income. But we know that the wealthy store their capital in many different ways. This was proposed as a wealth tax. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders both proposed wealth taxes. A number of European countries have tried wealth taxes, had mixed results. Would that be a feasible mechanism, you think, in the United States?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you have problems with any taxes, right? So even with income taxes, people evade them. They, move their money offshores in ways that it's hard to figure out, where their investment income is coming from. there are definitional problems. You kind of have a problem with any sort of tax you throw out there. Sales taxes, people will avoid that by paying in cash and not putting it on the books. And the wealth tax is no different. You've got enforcement difficulties that come with it. But there's something like 6-7 European countries who have wealth taxes right now. And, they do fine. They're not perfect, but they bring in some money, and they bring it from the wealthiest people in society. And so, it's worth doing.
Yeah. And is there anything else you'd like to add just about kind of how you think we should rethink the way that we think about this gap?
I think one thing we should think about a little bit more on this, and this is more on the kind of conceptual, philosophical level, is I think that people are maybe not as thoughtful on, who did Jim Crow and slavery, like who kind of got cut down the most on that. Because I think when you present the fact that, hey, the difference is mostly between the top 10%, I think people recoil from that a little bit. They think that there's something goofy and weird going on. But, I think it's worth pointing out that, in a capitalist system in general, right, the bottom half, the middle class, they get their money comes in the door, money comes out the door. They don't accumulate very much. It's really only the top that's capable of accumulating a lot.
Right.
And so it shouldn't be surprising that that's where you find the difference.
Right.
It shouldn't be surprising that when they expropriated all those black farmers back in the day, that's going to show up in the top 10%, because people who own their own land, that's they're relatively well off to own your own land. Like most black people and most white people didn't own their own land, or even things like redlining. If you're in the bottom class, lower classes of black people, you were not ever getting a home. You were going to rent all the time. So redlining really hurt middle class and especially upper class black families who are unable to buy in better areas and got worse. And so, it shouldn't be shocking that this is how it plays out. And it just kind of adds a little more texture to the story, as opposed to, I think for some people, they view it as, oh, you're just trying to say, there was no racism or oppression and so on. It's like, no, that's not true at all. It's just, we need to think harder about where that would have materialized. And for the most part, it's keeping down the black upper class, people who would have owned things, people who would have had businesses, because that's where the wealth would have accumulated. And that's where they stopped the wealth from accumulating. The bottom would have never accumulated wealth. The bottom 30% of white families have an average of $980, right? It would have never had any.
And I think sometimes when we have the more thin discussion, it really does sound like they're talking about two people. There's a black person and a white person. The white person has it great, black person has it terrible. And it's like, when you grow up outside Atlanta like me, and you see Buckhead and entertainment empires and Fortune 500 CEOs, you realize that the story is a little bit more complicated than that. Like, there are actually people in both groups who have it really great, and there are people in both groups who don't have it, like have almost next to nothing. And from your research, it sounds like a lot of people have almost next to nothing. So that any just solution to that would be to get the people who have next to nothing, no matter what they look like or their family or history background, some more stuff. Right. And that's what I really appreciated about this report.
Right. And to the extent that that group is disproportionately non-white, you kill two birds with one stone. So
yeah, more the merrier. But Matt, it was great having you, and take it easy.
All right. Thanks.